Okay. Hi everyone. We thought we'd try a different format today because the weather is unbelievable. Nice, but unbelievably nice.
It is absolutely beautiful.
I mean, we're in jumpers, guys, and it's March.
I'd say I'm not even in a jumper. I'd say I'm in a Henley.
And gonna look that up.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's March and it's in Scotland and it's so sunny and lovely, and the birds, as you can probably hear, are singing their merry songs. And so the idea of recording a podcast inside felt almost illegal.
Yeah, and where we are right now, we're in a nice little valley, and we're walking next to a burn, which is Scottish for stream. So you might hear the water sort of tinkling. We're about to walk over a bridge. Anyway, the point is it's very beautiful, and we thought this would be much nicer than sitting in front of computers.
But we are on a public footpath, so there may be some points where we have a chat with someone about their dogs. So here we go. Anyway, this week we wanted to talk about this prescriptive emergent continuum that we talk about quite often. And I guess it sort of lies at the heart of everything that we do. So we ran a webinar on this last week. And
We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll link to that if you want more details. But it kind of encapsulates how we started at Wild Strong and how we ended up where we are. And I guess it's just constantly sort of challenging how we're taught to teach movement, and also how we are taught as adults to move, and how actually there are lots of different ways to learn to move. So let's get into it, Andy.
All right. So I guess
start right at the beginning.
Yeah, well, let's provide some context. So when I first started getting into teaching movement, I'd already had a few years of teaching under my belt, but then I decided that I wanted to get more into fitness and exercise and things like that. So I got my AC, which is sort of just like your bog standard certified personal training certification. I did CrossFit, I did Olympic lifting, and then I got my CSCS, which is more sports conditioning. So the idea of you're working with athletes and things like that. And I didn't really realize it at the time, but all of these certificates, all these certifications, they all assume the same style of teaching. I didn't have the words for it back then, but it's kind of this idea that you're the coach, you're the font of all knowledge. You have these special movements that you know how to do. You know how to do a barbell back squat. You know how to do a clean and jerk or a snatch or whatever. And what you do is when someone comes and they say they want to learn how to move or they want to learn exercise or whatever, what you do is you teach them these prescribed movements, because these are the good movements. Everybody should squat. Everyone should do a deadlift. Everyone should do an overhead press, whatever. And the idea is that there was good form and bad form. And your job as the coach was to get people to recreate the good form. And the main way you did this was by cueing people and essentially saying, okay, that was pretty good, but now I want you to change your shoulder angle or your knee angle or something like that. And you would do a lot of external cueing. So you'd say, okay, I want you to try to stand as tall as possible, like you're trying to hit your head in the ceiling, or I want you to imagine that I'm putting a tangerine in between your shoulder blades and I want you to squeeze it. And that would get people to retract their shoulder blades and push their chest out. Or I might say, okay, I want you to imagine that you have a 20-pound bill in between your bum cheeks, and I want you to squeeze it as hard as you can so no one can take it from you. And that would help.
My least favorite cues.
And that would help with hip extension. Or, you kind of get the idea. And the idea is that through the process of cueing and feedback and things like that, eventually you would get people to move properly. So that's kind of the basic assumption that I was coming out of. And even with things like CrossFit, this idea with CrossFit was it was supposed to use all these different modalities and all these different kinds of movements. But what I always say the original sin about CrossFit is that they still just got people to do gym movements. Maybe that they were, quote unquote, functional movements or whatever. But the idea is like, we're gonna get a bunch of people together and we're gonna make a sport where you are going to squat in a certain way or you going to snatch. And then there's also this idea that there's going to be a judge or something, and they're going to determine whether or not what you had was a good rep. In CrossFit competition, the word you don't want to hear is no rep. And that means that you did some sort of rep in a way that didn't conform to whatever the points of performance were. So is this weird thing about CrossFit is it's supposed to be a sport, But what you're doing is you're actually doing the same movements over and over and over again. You're not really trying to solve movement problems. Sometimes you are. Like sometimes it'll be like, okay, I want you to do 30 pull-ups as quickly as possible. And that's where CrossFit came up with these solutions like butterfly or kipping pull-ups, where the only goal was to get your chin over the bar. So you found an efficient way to cycle that didn't look like a strict pull-up. But you know, it still fell into this idea of what's now called rules-based challenges or rules-based training, where it's the same as if you had, say, like a gymnast or a figure skater, and they do a routine. Ultimately, there's going to be an external arbiter, a judge who's going to say, this was good, this was worth 9 points, this is worth 10 points. But there's not really an expectation that you're doing anything. It's not even really task-based. And what I mean is with task-based, you say, hey, I want you to get from here to there. I want you to pick this up and move this. I want you to solve a movement problem of some kind. So I'm gonna let Jill jump in.
But I think for me, as somebody that doesn't come from a fitness background, in that I've always been very happy outside and moving, but then I did try and go to the gym because my knees were playing up and the physio kept telling me to go to the gym. I just got really sort of, I found the whole environment wasn't my thing, and that's fine. Since discovered that's okay.
Yeah.
But I think I found within the class setting, I found all of the cueing really sort of, what is the word?
Disempowering?
I guess it is disempowering. Like I just got completely stuck in my head and then was kind of worried that I was the only person that didn't know what I was doing. And in hindsight, it probably wasn't. But just really...
May I jump in?
Well, it just really meant that I couldn't participate.
Yeah, I mean, quite famously, and I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I'm going to bring it up. I think the first time I ever tried to get you to do a goblet squat, I think you started crying.
I did start crying.
And I think I'm a really nice coach. And I think that maybe it's just not very nice being coached from, you know, your partner. So maybe it's part of that. But I think that's a really good example.
Yeah, I was also, I think, it's really infuriating being coached by your partner. But also I was so caught up in my head and I was in this environment that I wasn't comfortable in because it was like a CrossFit gym. There wasn't actually, there were like a few people around, but it felt like this whole world that I wasn't part of. And I guess my first introduction to CrossFit, having never really understood what it was when we first got together and I went and you were the judge at that competition.
Yeah, I was...
And so this is like, if you don't know what CrossFit is, this is the most extreme end of CrossFit is this competition. And to my mind, I think CrossFit lost something when they started putting in the competition because I think they just ended up funneling everyone into this competition. And I understand that people really love it.
CrossFit Open and CrossFit Open Prep and
but
things
it's
like
like
that.
a different, I understand that, you know, anyway, this is another conversation, but it was the more extreme end of CrossFit. So there were just loads and loads of like absolutely stacked guys who were quite obviously, in hindsight, now that I understand how steroids work, quite obviously taking quite a lot of steroids, just sort of wandering around being their best selves.
Yeah, and also listening to like new metal music and things like that. Listening to like Limp Bizkit or whatever.
And I just remember watching being like, who is this guy that I've started dating? Because this side of you was not. Anyway, Andrew was judging. He was not wandering around.
I wasn't one of the stacked guys,
No.
put it that way. And
anyway, it all just kind of, all was part of that system. And for me, it was just such a kind of, I would never, I cannot find my feet in this
there's 2
place.
points I want to make about that. One of them, the smaller point, is I was never really that person. You know, I always had one foot in the door in CrossFit because I thought that the community aspect of it was very interesting. You know, I thought this idea of CrossFit recreating a third space, this idea of CrossFit, you know, at that point I already read Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, and I sort of saw it as a new example of a civic organization, you know. So I thought that the proposition of CrossFit, I thought was very powerful. But I want to go back to what you were saying, because I think it's such a good point, which is how disempowering the coaching process is. And I think often it is invisible to the coaches or the personal trainers themselves because they spend all this time learning how to cue, learning how to coach, whatever, thinking themselves in this position. But actually, I don't think they realize how much agency they can take from people. And I'll give you an example. You could have someone who's like a competent person. You know, they are able to walk up the steps to go to the gym, open up the door, dress, undress themselves, whatever, get dressed into their workout clothes, carry a bag, pick up their children, go grocery shopping, all this stuff, and they don't even think about it. And then you put them in this weird situation, this gym, where the lighting is weird, the music is weird, there's a bunch of strange instruments, people are doing these sort of repetitive, sort of arcane movements you don't really understand. There's a strange sort of ritual and culture to the gym. So already it's sort of off-putting. And these people come in and all of a sudden you say, I'm gonna teach you a new movement. I'm not gonna anchor it to anything specifically. Maybe I will. Maybe I'll say, okay, well, this will help you with this or that. Or maybe I won't. Maybe say, today I'm going to teach you a bent over row. And I'm going to demo it to you. And this is the correct way to do it. And this is what I want you to do. I want you to retract your shoulder blades. I want you to keep your spine neutral. I want you to push your hips back. I want you to keep your shins vertical. Don't lock out your knees, but also keep them stiff. And you're just throwing all these different things at people. And then they're trying to do the movement. They don't understand the why of the movement. They don't understand even what it's supposed to feel like. And then they're looking over to you and you're either saying, oh, that's really good, but do this a little bit differently and do this a little bit differently and focus on this and try to do this and shift that. And because it's not actually embedded in the real world, because they're not actually doing a thing, it's such an abstract movement, they have no reference point of whether or not they're doing it well, which means that all they have is the feedback of the coach or the trainer. And then the coach or trainer thinks like, oh God, this person doesn't know how to move. They don't know how to hip hinge. You know, they don't know the difference between soft knees and lock knees. You know, they don't know the difference between a hinge and a squat and all these things that are largely just made up labels that didn't exist as schema in this person's brain until they walked into the gym, and you're telling them that they're doing it wrong.
I was thinking, and so we talk about the touch on this in the webinar, but I guess part of the reason we started Wild Strong, well, there are many reasons, but one of the main reasons is that I needed to do something, I needed to get stronger. But I realised that my place is not in the gym and I wanted to do something outdoors, but I didn't want it to be sort of boot campy, and I've always been really keen not to call it a boot camp because I don't like the military link at all. I know that boot camps just sort of now become synonymous with that outdoor exercise, and that annoys me. But anyway, that's another conversation. But the big piece that we kind of were missing all this time, I guess, was because we were kind of looking at Wild Strong, and I guess you came out of CrossFit and personal training, and I came out of just sort of wanting to be outside and being red. And we both, maybe it's because we both have an anthropology background or some general interest in people. I guess there's always that public health lens on everything that we do. And I know, like you did your master in public health, but I worked in public health for the first part of my career anyway. And I think that side of it has always meant that we've sort of had a bit of foot in fitness, but not too much of a foot in the fitness industry. And I think where I'm going with this is that there is always this missing piece when we started with Wild Strong, because we were always looking at how can we build these communities and help other people build them in their communities and really meet people where they're at. And I think that's where Nature Moves came in. And then since we've been kind of playing around on this continuum of prescriptive movement teaching, which we still do in like some of our in-person classes, and Strong for Life, like this is our bone density course, and that is mostly prescriptive, and then we layer in the fun stuff latterly.
Should we define this and then jump back into it?
Oh sure, yeah, on you go.
So as we started spending more and more time with real people, I think we both realized that a lot of the assumptions that we had sort of baked into Wild Strong when we first started it, you know, they came from CrossFit, they came from strength and conditioning. Even though we were outside and we were trying to do practical movements, we were trying to get people to do things, I kept on running in these contradictions where when I was trying to do things in a certain way, I realized that it was disempowering, and I saw people, I always use the words getting tangled up. So I remember one of the first times it really came to me is I was trying to teach people how to do vaults. You know, so a vault is just where you see an obstacle and you try to pop yourself over it. And if I hadn't said anything, if I had just said, I'm going to give you 5-10 minutes and I want you to try to get over this box or this log as many times as you can, you know, as you gain confidence, I just want you to go ahead and try to add a little bit more speed or height or whatever and just see what happens. If I'd left people alone, they probably would have learned something that looked like a step fault or looked like a safety fault, some kind of codified official movement, and they probably would just figure it out emergently. But, and there are lots of organizations that do this. I'm like, well, I'm going to systematically teach people how to vault. So I'm going to say, okay, I want you to come here and I want you to, this is going to tangle you up because you're just listening, but that's kind of the idea. As you come up, I want you to go ahead and put your right palm down on the object. And then I want you to go ahead and put your left foot on the object. And then I want you to go ahead and I want you to swing your right foot through. And I want you to use your left hand for balance. And it's going to look a bit like a break dancer. And obviously it's more confusing because you're hearing it audibly, but all of a sudden people would just stop and they'd pause and they'd get this hesitation. All of a sudden they get frustrated and they get tangled up. And that's just one example. And I kept on seeing this over and over and over again, that actually, if you just gave people a task and you told them, I want you to do this, I want you to try to get this over your head, then they would start figuring it out. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, what I was thinking about was how much time and effort and money we spent on trying to teach our children to swim.
Yeah,
and we bring this up in the
example.
webinar, but it really, I think when you have small children, it's really, everyone was like, right, we've got to go and do, got to go and do swimming lessons. So we went and did swimming lessons.
From like the age of 2 or less.
Yeah, and I do appreciate, like, if you're brought up somewhere with access to pools or water source that you can swim in, you can teach your kids to swim from a very, very young age without lessons just because you have access to a place. But where we were, we didn't really have access to that. So we paid for these swimming lessons, and mostly our kids really, really didn't like them. It was like a constant battle. And I just didn't, and we were going every week.
And it was hectic because you get there, you only have an hour. Yeah, there's COVID.
It's like a whole thing. And it was really hectic, and they were quite small.
You have to rush in, you have to take all the clothes off, you got to get them switched in, you got your 45-minute thing. They go in these lanes.
It was just an all-round not brilliant. And I'm sure there are teachers out there that do great stuff.
And some of the teachers were great, and they were really kind, actually. And I think...
But actually, products at the end, nobody could swim.
Nobody learned how to swim.
Neither of our kids learned to swim.
All this breaking down these movements and breaking them into chunks and having them do these repetitions and everything like that. We ended up with 2 kids who still couldn't swim and didn't really enjoy being in the pool by the end because it felt like obligatory.
No, and then we were going to Florida to see your family. And so I just set myself a target of taking them to the public pool every week. Because when we moved to Scotland, the pool's much closer. And we just went every week, and I didn't teach them anything, and they just played around the water.
Got confident.
And then they started swimming without
doing
anything. And then we went to Florida, and they just had like a whole couple of weeks of in and out the pool.
Yep, playing games, doing all the things also you're not really allowed to do. I'm not saying I advocate this, but running around, playing tag, roughhousing, jumping off the sides, bringing in squirt guns, doing stupid things like at the beginning, neither one of them were confident jumping off into the pool. I remember especially one of our kids, they'd act like they were going to jump and they'd lower themselves down and then they'd kind of plop themselves in one leg at a time. And by the end of the trip, to Florida, where it was just a nice warm pool, they were jumping and they were trying to learn how to dive and they were doing belly flops and cannonballs. And the point of it is it's just about giving people the room and the opportunity to move. And you hear this a lot, this idea, they actually use the analogy of a pool quite a lot. The difference between, we're about to jump over a gate here, speaking of vaulting.
Hang on a minute. Oh,
there's no hinge on this gate.
There we go.
All right.
Over.
Check to make sure we're still recording.
We're still recording.
Okay. So I'm on top of the gate right now. There we go. I just vaulted it beautifully. It was really graceful. And just sort of this idea of the difference between dropping someone in the deep end versus giving someone access to like a nice sort of slope where they can sort of dictate the pace that they want to engage with the challenge, which is kind of what the boys had the opportunity. And it was really different. It gave them this confidence. They figured things out themselves. It happened emergently. They were able to play games. So we're going back to this idea of prescriptive emergent continuum. So let's go back to that. So this is something that it's an idea that's danced around if you read any academic books on constraints-led approach or ecological dynamics, and we've got references in the webinar. But I remember we were teaching a Scotland course, and I kept on jumping into this contradiction where I want to do all this fun stuff and I want to give people a chance, but I also want to teach them, how to throw, how to throw a slam ball, or how to do this or how to do that. And I kept on finding I didn't have the language for it. And then I was flipping through, and in one of the books, they sort of had this, it's really simple. They're just saying, well, sometimes you do a session and it might be a little bit more teacher-led, prescriptive. And sometimes you do a session, it might be a bit more exploratory. And it wasn't really done in a continuum. It was just like 2 columns in a simple graphic. And that's when it really clicked for us, because we realized it's like, yeah, obviously this stuff is on a continuum. There are times when you do want to do that sort of prescriptive teaching, especially if you're preparing for a sport, or if you want to build like a very narrow specific capacity, or there's some kinds of competition or something like that. But there are also times where you just need to let people explore and figuring out for themselves. And it's okay to go back and forth, because I think sometimes as well, when people discover a lot of what's called this emergent learning or ecological dynamic principles or whatever you might call it, it's easy to become a purist and think, oh, no, I'm never allowed to cue, I'm never allowed to coach, I'm never allowed to show people things. But that's not really true. It's okay to draw attention to things. So now whenever we come up with a course, or if we try to come up with a module or something like that, we have this prescriptive emergent continuum. And on one side, on this prescriptive side, it's a lot of the traditional strength and conditioning. So this idea that it's coach-led, this idea that you try to quantify things, this idea that you're trying to increase your back squat by 5%, or you are trying to do something that's rules-based, you're trying to compete, all these sorts of things.
And I guess and other things like yoga and Pilates come into that. They're very top-down.
Yeah.
And you've got somebody at the front who knows everything, or there's an assumption that there's the person at the front who knows everything.
Yeah.
And they are giving a little bit of knowledge.
Yeah, and you're trying to recreate the correct form, the idea that there's these like Platonic ideals. And you see this a lot in Pilates and yoga and things like this, anything that has a lineage. So we could see the same thing in martial arts, where you have these traditional martial arts where you learn these kata and the instructor will change your elbow angle or wrist angle. And all of these...
I think about the self-defense thing, because I remember having self-defense lessons at school, and
yeah,
absolutely never went in, because it was like, right, the attacker's going to come at you like this. You're going to get your right hand. You're going to do this.
You put this, and then you do step 1, step 2, these very complicated dance moves.
No memory of how to do that at all, because it was so step by step, and it just didn't work with my brain.
Yeah, and what you find is this stuff doesn't work. And we discovered this back in the early 90s with UFC and things like that. This idea of aliveness in martial arts, where these sort of pre-programmed, it's funny, we're around lots of people now, so we're very conscious that we're using our podcaster voice.
Walking backwards because the wind is...
You might see which direction people are going. We might switch back in a second.
Just looking like a couple of weirdos.
Anyway, so we discovered this, where like martial arts, they need this element of aliveness, where this sort of dynamic relationship to the real world and the person that you are fighting or competing against. You can't memorize these scripts, because that's not how the world works. We also discovered this back in the 80s and 90s when they tried to create these expert systems in law and medicine and things like this, where they tried to create these if-then trees. If this happens, then do that. But that's not how the brain works. This is this idea of the homunculus that we're talking about, or the central processor, which is that there's this sort of old sort of computational model of how the brain works. And it's this danger whenever there's a new technology that comes out. People always try to say, this is how the brain works. This is how the body works. So when they first discovered steam power, you would see that all these medical analogies use steam. Or when they first discovered circulation, or when they first discovered electricity, or when they first discovered radio waves, or when they first discovered gears and levers and things like this. And what you see is every single time that we discover sort of a new technology or vocabulary, and we try to apply this to the human body. So a lot of the stuff that sort of came out in the post-war era was saying, okay, especially you see this in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, that the brain is like a computer. And we run these sort of predetermined motor patterns, and the CPU in your brain controls everything. And really what we found is that model is just completely wrong. The problem is that a lot of the learning theories that people are taught still have this assumption, which is why you have these tennis coaches trying to show people the perfect serve and getting this repetition over and over and over again. And yeah, yoga and Pilates, because you're not, okay, I don't want to step on any toes here, but this is when I guess we should talk about the difference between task-based and rules-based again.
Yeah.
Okay. The thing about yoga, especially the way it's traditionally taught, is that it's rules-based. This is what a good form looks like. This is what it's supposed to look like. Really, this you'll see a lot of traditional yoga teachers will teach based on what the final movement looks like, not what it feels like, and that's changing a lot. Yoga teaching is becoming generally more progressive in a way, but it's still ultimately these arbitrary positions that are imbued with all this meaning because of this idea of lineage. And that's when you see different schools or lineages arguing, oh, well, Iyengar teaches it this way, you know, but in a different style of yoga or a different teacher would teach it this way. And all this is funny because, like, ultimately with yoga, you're not solving a task. It's much different than what I would say like something like parkour. And I talk to Dan Edwards about this all the time. It's like parkour is just this emphasis on doing it, on just doing the thing. Can you get over that barrier? Can you get over that under it? Can you make the jump? Can you make, you know, if there's a challenge there, can you do it? Yes or no? How can you find a way to do it? It almost doesn't really care. It's sort of agnostic on how it's done as long as you solve the problem. So that's, again, part of this continuum is this, on one end, rules-based, this sort of top-down, which also is very similar to top-down and traditional teacher-centered models of pedagogy. And on the other end, you have this more emergent, you have this task-based, can you do it, but also much more of a student-centered way where people figure out solutions to the problems based on what they have available to them.
I think it's, so there's a few things here. So with Nature Moves, we sit all at the task-based and kind of emergent learning because we started Nature Moves working much with older populations. We didn't stipulate that it's for older populations, but that's we put the classes on in the middle of the day, and so most of our members are late 60s to kind of early 80s.
Yeah.
And our aims for Nature Moves are really get people outside, having a nice time, and building confidence without really thinking about it too much. There's not a specific goal that we're working on, whereas with Strong for Life, that's all on what does the science say for building bone mineral density and trying to build up capabilities first before bringing the kind of play and emergent learning in later, just because basically what I'm trying to say is that one works well with the other, but it's worth being aware of. But I was thinking about that conversation the other day and that tension that we have, particularly with Nature Moves. There's a real tension whenever it's difficult when you present the Nature Moves version of facilitation, and I'm using that word very intentionally because you are more of a facilitator than you are a coach in Nature Moves. It's really hard if we're working with people who come from a movement teaching background such as Pilates, yoga, or being a PT, because the models are so top down, it's really hard for them to step back and let the activities breathe and kind of let people figure things out without kind of hovering over them and giving them instruction. It's like a completely different skill set. And the other thing that we have tension with is when we talk about Nature Moves is we kind of butt heads a bit with, it doesn't sit within the traditional fitness industry model, so they don't really like it very much. And then I was just thinking about the conversation that we had last time we were looking at getting some research around Nature Moves. And yes, it is about movement and confidence and expanding capabilities, but it's equally about having a nice time, meeting people. And there's just a lot of different bits to it. We had a meeting with some biomechanists. We were quite excited about it, and then we just realised that they look at movement in a completely different way to us, and it was a funny meeting. So we're like, well, could we take this and do it in the lab and isolate it into one movement? It's like, oh,
yeah, working with biomechanists is funny because, you know, if we go back to this idea of a continuum, on one end, you know, biomechanists, they kind of have this very reductionist model. And reductionist doesn't always need to be a pejorative, but it's literally what they do is they try to take the movements of the human body and break them down into quantifiable kinematics. So like what's happening at this joint angle, what's happening here, you know, what degree of motion is happening here. So and actually it's sort of perhaps the strongest example of this sort of reductionist model of trying to take the human body and take what's actually a complex system of systems and turn it into a complicated machine. And I think it's good to talk about this difference between complexity and complicated. All right, so a watch is complicated. If someone builds a watch, it has lots of moving parts, but you could take a watch apart, and if you had the manual, or if you were working with a watchsmith, they could put it back together again. It's got lots of moving parts, okay, but you know what everything does. They have a set job, and you can take it apart and put it back together. That's complicated. Complex is different. When something is complex, it has lots of moving parts, but there are all these different systems, and each system will react to the other system. And when you react to another system, different things change. So an example is with balance. If we're talking about balance, okay, it's not just about standing on one leg and making sure that your center of gravity is over your base of support, and that if your base of support is too narrow and your center of gravity comes over the line, that you fall over, because you're constantly making all these adjustments. And then balance isn't static. Everyone always talks about, standing on one foot and brushing your teeth, but that's not how balance works. Balance is you're moving, you're carrying something, you're reacting. The ground surface is different. You've got all these things going on. And then there's this assumption that if you take the most reductive version of something, standing on one foot, there's this hope that there's going to be transfer of skill over to real life. And that's a problem, when we work with these biomechanists. They're like, well, what we'll do is we'll take what you do and we're going to put it in the lab, and we're going to get these different, we're going to get these different machines. We already have assumptions about what the optimal joint angle is and what the optimal, ground reactive forces are, things like that. And they try to reduce it, and they're going to say, well, we're going to take everything you do, reduce it into these movements. It's got people walking up. I might need to pause soon, or cut across down to the wild garlic or something. So you try to take all these things, you try to turn them these little teeny tiny parts and hope that they amount to something. But that, like Jill said, that's not what we do. So it's very interesting to work with this group of people whose jobs were to pick everything apart, as opposed to this idea of trying to have this like holistic big picture lens.
Right, sorry, we just had a little pause because it's such a beautiful day and everybody is out on a walk. We're back.
What a nice thing.
What a nice
Yeah,
thing.
so anyway, so I made my point about the biomechanist, and it's just the same sort of set of assumptions that we see all the time, which is this idea that in order to be correct, or I guess we also need to think about scientific replicability and things like that, where you really have to hone in on the smallest unit of something. So biomechanists will look at the joint movement, or they'll look at this angle, but it's the same thing that exercise physiologists will do. They're going to look at things at like the molecular level. Strength and conditioning coaches and exercise people, they look at these specific movements, even if it's a multi-joint movement, say like a squat or something. They're still looking at, are you going into internal external rotation? What's your hip flexion angle? What's your knee flexion angle? Things like that. So anyway, this is circling back now to when we started working with older populations, or making more inclusive classes, even before we even called it nature moves, because nature moves really came out of our early mistakes, my early mistakes, which is, I remember I decided I want to start running some classes. And okay, I'm going to bring the intensity down. I'm going to bring the weight down. It's not going to be like, this big emphasis on metabolic conditioning or, huffy puffy stuff. I just want to get people moving. But it's still this assumption that, okay, well, what are the important movements? People should be squatting. People should be hinging. People should be overhead pressing or pulling or whatever. And I found all these scaling options. Okay, so if someone can't do a squat like this, you can have them do a squat like this. If someone can't get their shoulder at this angle, then have this alternative. And I was working with a group, I think the first time, about 5 or 6 people. It wasn't very big. And as soon as I started, I realized, oh, this isn't going to work at all, because, someone has issues in their hips, someone has issues in their knees, someone has issues in their balance. And me trying to get people to recreate these movements because they're good, because I read in a textbook, or because I believe that they're good for a 25-year-old football player or whatever, there's just no carryover to reality there.
Also, and we spent a very long time researching sort of movements for all the populations and stuff, and that's kind of what informed those first few classes.
Yes.
And it was sort of almost immediate as we started doing the warm-up. It's like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And then we kind of went back, we were like, let's pull back on this. Like, what is our ultimate aim? for these sessions. These guys, they want to keep moving so they can keep doing all of the things that they do right. They're not coming for they're not coming for an exercise class. They're coming for more than that. And what is their aims? And we kind of sat down with them and did a mind map on like the movements that they are feeling anxious about, or that they've lost access to, or that are important to them as they get older. And then we just started looking at different kind of movement opportunity, like movement teaching, and a lot of the things that we do now come out of sort of progressive PE teaching.
Yeah.
From all of the nature move stuff, most of that is, when I look at the movements that they do, I'm just thinking about the class you run this morning. You know, it's a big class, really mixed capabilities.
Yeah, we had like 15 people today from the age of, I think, of 60 to about 83, 84.
And the movements that they are doing, because they're doing it through working with partners, figuring things out, they were ending up in these positions that they never would end up in, having a really good time doing it. And then, I don't know, I guess all of this has kind of come into focus again as we're starting to look at falls and falls resilience stuff.
I guess
as well.
There's two things, if I could jump in on that.
Yeah, of course.
I really want to make sure we talk about the assumptions still coming out of the fitness industry or health services.
No, I was going to say there was a good conversation the other day with somebody who trained up through Nature Moves.
Yeah, this is a good point. Okay.
Can I talk about that?
Yeah, please do. Jump in.
Okay, no names. It was just interesting in that we were talking about that tension earlier about when you bring somebody in with a fitness background or with a yoga and Pilates background, which is very top down, and you give them expose them to the ideas of sort of ecological dynamics and letting the environment teach, and leaving people space to work together to figure things out. It's a totally different skill set, and it can feel quite alien, I think, if you come from more of a top-down teaching background. Anyway, we were chatting with one of our Nature Moves facilitators, and they said, oh, it's been really great because I had a PT in the sessions, and they've been really helping me help everybody work on their optimal form for over-unders. Now, over-unders are something that we essentially made up. I mean, people do the whatever, but we basically just use sticks, and you have to challenge your partner to get over and under them in different ways. There is no good or bad way of doing it. There's a good way because you've done it and you found a way that your body is capable of doing it and that works for you. And it was just a funny conversation where we were kind of like, oh, that's interesting. I'm not sure if there is an optimal way of doing it over under. This is much more about partner work and people figuring things out and finding solutions that work for them. To which they replied, oh yes, I'd kind of forgotten that and got sucked into that way of thinking again.
PTs can't help themselves, personal trainers, because they want to say, oh, keep your bum down, your chest up, and then, you'll hit a different hip angle or something like that. But, and I want to clarify this because I actually don't think we've said it explicitly during this conversation. Like, what Nature Moves is we present problems or challenges, and then we try to elicit solutions from the group based on what's available to them. Can you get over this? Can you get under this? So it's really on the side of emergent, where we never tell people how to do anything. All we ever do is present a challenge and see how they solve it. And by working with their partner, they can sort of moderate and calibrate the challenge so it's appropriate for them, so they can kind of come up with new solutions, and then constantly just building up people's confidence.
And it might just be that one week, some people just come for a chat.
Yeah.
And they do a bit, and that's fine too. Nature Moves looks very different to an exercise class. That people come for loads of different reasons.
And this brings up, one of my other things, and then I think we can jump into where we're talking about like big wellness or big, I don't know, falls prevention. We'll jump into that in a second. But there's something that they talk about a lot in public health, which is this idea of a type 3 error. And a type 3 error is essentially when you set up a study or you're trying to figure out the mechanism, something, whatever, and you're not even asking the right question. It'd sort of be like, if I ask a question, it's like, oh, does the phase of the moon affect the severity of COVID symptoms or something like that? And I don't know, maybe it does, but it's like, that's like, you're not, like the question you're asking, it's so far out, it's almost not even wrong. It's almost not even falsifiable, because You're trying to connect two things. And what I mean is, so often people completely mistake. They put the cart before the horse, or they lose the forest through the trees, and they get so obsessed with these. The question they'll ask is like, in this class, are people achieving optimal hip flexion? And that's the wrong question. That's not the question. It's, are people moving? Are they interacting with each other? Are they having a nice time? Are they building confidence? Are you building their action capacities? Are you giving them tools so they can take this into the real world and transfer it and play with their grandkids and things like that? And this idea of, is this optimal? And this is the other thing, and then I'll bat it back to you, Jill, is this idea of optimality is almost like this perverse question, because optimality depends on how you're defining it. And there's this paper that came out last year that I talk about all the time, and it's essentially called the myth of optimality, because like, what is optimal? And the example they use is like, if you're walking, a biomechanist might come in here and say, oh, you're not using the optimal gait pattern. Maybe I'm not being generous to them, but I could be oversimplifying this. But you're not using the optimal gait pattern, but you're not asking, why is the person walking? Okay. Are they doing power walking with a group? Are they on icy surfaces? Is it a teenager who's grumpy and they want to signal that they're grumpy by walking with a big slouch to let their parents know? Is it someone who's walking down the street and they want to look tough so nobody talks to them? These are all different versions of why someone might be walking. Are you carrying something? Are you in a hurry? Whatever, are you walking next to someone on a first date? All these things are going to be different forms of walking. So for someone to come and say, you're not using optimal gait, well, for what purpose? Because the optimal gait for me to walk like a tough guy down a city so that no one messes with me is going to be much, much different from the gait pattern if I'm walking over some slippery ice. And this is...
Yeah, the whole thing about optimality really irritates me, because I think it's such a pithy message to share on Instagram or social media.
Yeah.
Because it's so concise and it's so easy to peddle, but I think it is very disempowering, because I think people get tied up in this. It links to all of that. Well, gosh, am I not doing? So I'm not running correctly,
yeah,
or I'm not breathing correctly, or I'm not lifting correctly. I'm going to do, all of this stuff, and I just think ultimately it stops people from participating. And then we end up in that weird place where you're not doing it because you're worried about injury,
yep,
or you're not doing it because you're worried that you're going to do it wrong. But the risk of risk of like not doing something versus the risk of doing something a little bit wrong but doing it anyway.
Yep.
It irritates me so much. I've sort of felt a bit paralyzed on social media recently, because the messaging around that is so it's so deeply embedded, and I think particularly for women.
Yep.
You're just worried. You're worried that you're not doing it right. You don't know where to start, and so you just don't.
Yep. And this whole idea, if one wants to go out and work with people, the first thing you have to do is you have to do a risk analysis. What's the risk? And like, imagine if you started something with everything that could go wrong, of all the bad things that could happen. It's like,
and you listed it in a form.
You listed, like, Jill, like if I had asked you out on the first date, I'm like, okay, here's all the things that could happen. I could get really drunk and embarrass myself. By the way, whatever, do you want to go on a date with me? Like, obviously you wouldn't do anything else in your life by first focusing on all the negatives. So luckily there's been some progress over time of this idea of the risk reward balance, or, they have different words for it. But yeah, when you always focus on the risk, and I know you said this, I just want to say it again, it's that we're so good, like at a systems level, of measuring bad outcomes or measuring injuries or measuring things that could happen, but we're not even measuring the good stuff. So that's it. It's like we have this database of falls, and we know what people are doing when they're falling, but we're not looking at what people are or aren't doing the other 23 hours and 59 minutes in the day, all the other stuff that they're doing, because the system is just looking for rates of falls. So if you're a doctor, or if you're someone who's working in the professional health sphere, your whole goal is to make sure that somebody doesn't fall. And if you could say, okay, I've got a great new method for people not falling, what I'm going to do is I'm going to strap you down into a bed and just feed you Huel all day, and you can watch television, you're not going to fall. But then what we don't do is we don't look at all the other things. Well, why do people have osteoporosis? Why are people's confidence so low? All these things. So we've sort of scared people into doing nothing, where that's the exact wrong question. We have to think, how can we invite people to participate in the world around them?
Just for clarity, I don't think anyone is strapping anyone down into a bed and feeding them Gill.
No, that was a bit of an exaggeration.
I think we could go on. So we are looking, we're now researching falls preparedness and falls resilience. And so it's letting us look at all the different fields of thought around falls. I think that's probably for another episode. We've been talking for quite a long time now.
Yeah.
We should probably stop. Anyway, if you're interested, we did a webinar on the prescriptive to the sort of emergent continuum. And you're welcome to watch it, and I've linked it in the show notes. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with some more rambly thoughts about things. All right, see you soon.
See you soon.